Chapter 271, City Planning. Dinner quickly devolved into plans to upgrade the village and hastily scrawled potential city maps. The open area between the village and the manor was turning out to be their greatest asset, as it gave them the perfect place to put the new housing while still being attractive to the occupants. Living on the outskirts of town was nice if you had a large family and enough money to support a staff to take care of a large compound. But for most of the residents, especially the ones who were coming to work in other shops, it was better to have smaller units available and in an area that could be said to be relatively safe. Putting those houses in between the manor and the sheriff's office was perfect as far as safety was concerned. Plus, it gave them the opportunity to make the new housing resistant to invasion. All they had to do was to turn the buildings to face each other, with an end building turning the area into a dead-end street. But there was an issue with that as well, and Dominic noticed it immediately. Streets like this in the city are the most dangerous areas to be. The criminal elements will move in and monitor the entrance, knowing that those who come in have no other way out. Not just for outsiders, but it can be incredibly dangerous for the locals as well, and it might lead to problems that we're just not ready to deal with. He noted. Alexis looked at her proposed map in dismay. From a military standpoint, it was brilliant, as long as you were the defenders. But trying to clear the area if it became overrun with gang activity? A pure nightmare. The area wasn't just a trap, it was a shooting gallery. Alright, that might not be the best. But what if we left both ends open? Then the side streets would be residential facing each other, and from the main road, the first floors of the buildings could all be used as shops, with residential above them, which enters from the back. She suggested. Dominic and Julio both nodded. That works for me. Normally, I would suggest putting the shops up about 3 meters, with no basement windows on the main street side. But this village isn't expecting much horse traffic, is it? Julio suggested. Alexis laughed. The man was utterly practical. Moving the main floor up and having windowless basements or low walls between the basement entrance and the street was standard design for older cities with many horses. The dung tended to pile up and gave the main roads a rather distinct odor. However, that issue had long since been solved in the more advanced cities. Even in most of the villages' insignia, they limited the places that you could take a horse so that the cleanup was relatively easy. Which reminded Dominic he would have to have someone make a street sweeper at some point. Westover had originally just had a mage come through with magic and push it all into a compost pile for the farmers to gather fertilizer from. However, he hadn't found a spell gem of any sort in the village, so the technique was likely lost. Once dinner finished, Dominic and Alexis retired to the library for the evening. The princess was in the middle of a romance novel, and Dominic needed to work on his spell book a little more. He was getting close to advancing it again, and while it took a lot of work to get to every level, even 1 or 2 more would make such a large difference to the speed with which he could do infrastructure projects that it would definitely be worth it. An hour after they curled up together on one of the sofas, Alexis tilted her head back to look at him. Do you think that we are going to see more attacks by mages and monsters right away? Dominic wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her forehead. I can almost guarantee it. But we've got people looking into where these last ones might have come from, and we will have a defense force soon enough. Having monsters attacking the village isn't optimal, but it is also a chance to stock up on monster cores for the future city guard force. They're going to need spell gems once we have a real force and not just a militia, and that means they'll need to level them up and the officers will need a bit of a boost. He replied. Alexis slumped down against his chest. You know, I had thought that they had given up on that. But now that we've found one, I'm wondering if there are more still hiding in the region. There are no other people around to have reported them, so there could actually be a significant force still hiding in the wilderness of the Stantia province. The princess slapped at Dominic's hand as it wandered a bit too high up her belly, but Dominic was mostly lost in thought. I will speak to the general and have him change the training to make a town guard immediately, and not just a militia. We might not have many who can take up the position, but we have a lot of soldiers. If nothing else, I can at least arm the duchy well enough that scattered groups like the one that we encountered won't become a major threat. However, it might be best to report this to the king. If these mages are still affiliated with Dagos or Prince Kaizan, he will want to know. Alexis nodded. I will inform them in the next message. I don't expect any sort of reinforcements for at least a few months, but we might get a shipment of military supplies at the very least. She agreed. That would go a long way. I will leave the details to you. You're better versed than I am in all things military anyhow. Dominic agreed with a teasing smile. And you love me for it. Now, enough deep talk. It's time for bed, husband. Chapter 272. Properly Delegated. Dominic rolled over as the morning sun hit his face, then shifted so that he was still blocking it from Alexa's face. His whole upper body was covered in slowly fading love bites and claw marks, but Dominic noticed that the rate of natural healing was distinctly faster than it had been even a week ago. The change was unlikely to be due to age. 1 week older wouldn't make much difference. But it might be due to his increased magical affinity, as he had been practicing so much. Dragons were innately magical creatures, and most of their power lay in their magical abilities. So, the more magic that he awakened, the more of his draconic bloodline he would have access to. Dominic didn't know what that would mean for him in the future, but for now, just being able to heal from an evening of strenuous exercise and minor injuries in a few hours' sleep was enough of a benefit. Movement in the corner of the room caught his attention, and Dominic watched one of the maids setting out breakfast for them, as well as the amusement shining in her eyes. Unlike some nobles, they didn't require a maid to be on duty all night, waiting on their call. The master bedroom had bell pulls, and they could ring to wake someone up if it was urgent, but most nights they wouldn't need anything of the sort. The kitchen staff was already up in the small hours of the morning to get the day's work underway, and that was the most likely group of staff that they might need. My lord, you have guests waiting downstairs. I have set out clothing for you on the dressing table in the shower. She informed him in a soft voice. Thank you. Please come stand over here. Dominic replied, with a gesture at a spot between him and the window. The maid looked confused, but complied as Dominic got out of bed. Perfect. Now, if you move, the light will hit her face, and it won't be my fault. The maid's soft giggle followed Dominic into the shower, where he quickly prepared for the day and headed back to grab a bit of breakfast before starting his workday. The guests were one of the farmers with tattoos from his neck to his knuckles, and the more practical of the techno-wizards. Both bowed politely when Dominic came down the stairs, then got right to business. My lord, Pops informed us that you might be willing to pay for road improvements. I have reserved a tractor for the day, and the attachments are ready. The farmer informed him. That man is a treasure. He always knows what I need. Yes, I was planning to ask for exactly that. I want the roads improved from here to each of the barony manors, so that cargo can move over stone roads and not get bogged down during the rainy season. Dominic agreed. The techno-wizard nodded. We can do that in 1 day. With the steam tractors to level and pack everything, all it needs is 10 centimeters of stone to make a decent surface. When that stone cracks, it will break into large bricks, and we will have a rough cobblestone road. Not the smoothest surface, but still sturdy enough that the wagons won't get bogged down in the mud. The farmer nodded. I worked on an imperial road crew for a while, and I can make a proper road. My magic might not be as good as the elder, but driving the tractor while keeping an earth transformation spell active is easy enough. Dominic nodded. So, each of you will take half the road? The techno-wizard shook his head. No, I will do the gravel underlay, as that needs to be thicker, and he will transform the top layer of dirt into stone. Don't worry, we will make roads that will last a generation. Dominic chuckled. Some of the stone roads, like the river highway that ran through Kynwyn and into Axbridge, were centuries old and simply had their upper stones repaired once a generation as wagon wheels rutted them. So, he reached into his storage and handed each of the men a few gold coins, the daily rate for a skilled magician. Both smiled. Thank you for your generosity, your grace. We won't let you down. Then the farmer motioned east out the door. You should know, there is a caravan coming from Signia as well. Not merchant guild, not army. Most likely, someone got word that there is a lord who isn't overrun with refugees and might have food. The hunters had a bad feeling about them, so the new guards are all expecting trouble. Dominic sighed. I should have expected that today wouldn't go so easily. All right, I will go and meet them. Where is the sheriff right now? The farmer shrugged. Likely at the inn having breakfast. He's another terrible cook if it's not biscuits and beans, so he often drops in for breakfast and dinner. Dominic smirked as he heard the kitchen staff laughing. Perhaps it's not sword handling but basic cooking classes that we should be teaching the men of Westover. I will go find the sheriff, and we will sort everything out before they trouble any of the farms. The trio parted ways when they left the manor, as the inn was on the other side of town from the smithy, where the equipment was parked. But the farmer had been right. The sheriff was at the inn for breakfast, sitting on the patio, so he could watch the convoy approaching the outlying farms. If they started trouble, he could be there in 2 minutes on horseback.
Nate.
How's breakfast? Lord Dominic. Nearly done my coffee. Should we go greet the caravan before someone gets run through with a spear? They're already breaking off to pilfer fields. Fortunately, they were still far enough out that they were not in the freshly worked ones. Sheriff Nate agreed, his gray eyes narrowed in annoyance. Chapter 273. Bad Vibes. They didn't bother with a horse, and simply jogged out of town, stretching out their muscles for the morning. With the magical physical enhancements that both had, even a few kilometers was just a light warm-up. Nate had his badge hung from his vest, making it immediately obvious that he was a lawman, while Dominic was in a red and gold coat that was impossible to mistake for anything but a nobleman. The fact that both had rifles slung over their shoulders was the part that made the convoy come to an immediate stop, though. Looking at the refugees, it was obvious why the farmers had been suspicious of them. They looked more like a bandit group than actual refugees. Some had rags on, and they all looked a bit too skinny, but some were wearing expensive jewelry that didn't match their clothing, and the visible gang tattoos said that most of them weren't upstanding citizens to begin with. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Westover Duchy. What brings you all this way on such a fine morning? Nate greeted them with his hand casually on his pistol holster. The closest of the refugees raised his hands in a placating gesture. Sheriff, we mean no harm. We're just looking for a safe spot to settle down. We came from Castle City when the food started to get low. The Merchants Guild showed up with relief supplies from upriver, and you're the first inhabited spot we've found that isn't in a worse spot than Castle City. The man replied. Nate frowned. Are you willing to work for your keep? We don't accept layabouts, beggars, or thieves. A few of the refugees looked amused at the thought. One sheriff wasn't nearly enough to keep a town free of unsavory sorts. Dominic smiled. The king has given me free rein to deal with criminals as I see fit. So far, we haven't had many issues, but I have no issue reminding the world why they call me the Butcher of Westover. Most of the refugees went pale in the face at that announcement. They had lived near this border all their lives. Half the population lived in fear that whatever cursed being lived on the other side of the border would come looking for them if they were out after dark. Nate gave Dominic a strange look. Was that the sort of thing that you told people with your full chest? The Butcher of Westover was a horror story you whispered by candlelight, with the windows shut tight. Not someone who faced you with a smile and promises of violence in the morning light. But Dominic kept speaking. We do have a number of farms empty at the moment, for those willing to work the land. Housing in town is limited, but we are building more. If you would like to permanently settle in Westover, you are welcome. If not, we can help you along your way, though I can't promise that there will be anywhere worth stopping. The cities in Stancha province have the same issue that Castle City does, and the relief food shipment came from the duchy. The refugee group's leader waved the others closer. So, you're saying that all that food, 3 whole carts, came from here? Dominic nodded. The king purchased a whole harvest to provide relief supplies for Castle City. That means the wild crops we found aren't just luck? The other fields are still producing well? He asked. Dominic nodded. Indeed. The man paused, and someone behind him spoke up. And no pretentious nobles telling us how to live our lives. That made both Dominic and Nate laugh. What? Did you miss the part where I am Dominic Wavemates, the Duke of Westover? My rules might be less pretentious compared to some others, but there is very little mercy for those who break them. Dominic explained. There was a lot of discussion among the refugees, and the group slowly started to separate into 2 factions. Dominic pretended that he couldn't hear the whispered slurs about demi-humans pretending to be noble, or about an upstart duke who thought that the peasantry was something that he could control just by setting rules. Alexis insisted that his innate bias toward the people of Wavemates clouded his thought processes when determining who was trustworthy, but this sort of casual disrespect was something that human nobles didn't ever have to deal with. After a few minutes, the argument started to get heated enough that Nate was considering whether he should step in, but the refugee group sorted it out by themselves. Fine, if you want to stay here with some demi-human playing at being a duke, you can. But we're going to look for a respectable noble estate who can take us in. There was no shortage of casualties during the war. There has to be empty land. One of the men insisted. Nate cleared his throat. In that case, follow the river to the highway, then head west. There are entire abandoned villages there, which will soon have established Signia nobles taking over their management. You will have a place to stay, and an old blood family in charge of your territory. He omitted the part where many of the people who were currently here in Westover had come from the Coster area, 100 and some kilometers west of the river, down the highway. The situation there wasn't great, but there were plenty of empty villages and tilled fields, ready to be taken over by new residents, assuming they didn't starve to death before they could get a harvest in. After the refugee group's leaders separated the ones willing to stay and work from the ones who were either grifters or simply didn't want to stay here, there were only 10 remaining. The others simply kept moving along, bypassing the village entirely, while the local farmers watched them suspiciously. As they passed out of sight, the man who had first greeted them turned to Dominic. "How did you know, Your Grace?" Dominic shrugged. "That they were trouble? Not really. I just went with the feeling that they were giving the locals. The vibe that a group of refugees gives is actually pretty reliable. If they were looking for work, they would have been paying more attention to the land, looking for good places to settle. But other than looking to fill their bags with wild vegetables, the group wasn't interested." The leader of the small group that stayed chuckled. "Well, it's not like any of us know the first damn thing about farming. We're all city folk from the outskirts of Castle City. Our homes were destroyed during the attacks, but frankly, we're tired of living in an overcrowded slum. The others, they all came from somewhere else, thinking they'd make it big with their skills. But there's no work anywhere and no empty shops to set up in, even if they had money for inventory." Nate sighed. "So, now we get to find a spot for the lot of you. I don't suppose any of you are family members?" 4 of the 10 raised their hands, and the sheriff smiled. "Well, that's a start. That means we've got 6 singles and no rooming house." Dominic shrugged. "There are still a few empty houses until we get one built. Sharing a house with others is better than sleeping in the mud. Let's get you all settled, and you can introduce yourself around looking for work. There isn't much here either, but there are plenty of new shops who might need someone who knows how to prove themselves." Chapter 274. To industrialize? By the time that they got to the village, Julio was ready with a selection of housing options and good news from the Merchants Guild. "My lord, the guild got my message, and they will be sending a full construction crew with a Magitech architect on the next convoy. They are guild employees, so the rate will be reasonable but not cheap. These are the houses that are ready to move into. How did you want to separate these folk?" he asked. "There is one family and then a bunch of singles, but we don't have a rooming house in town yet. Just pick one of the larger houses, and they can sort out bedrooms and living arrangements." Dominic replied. One of the women gave him a hopeful look, and Dominic nodded.
"Right.
Also, they will be looking for work if you have a list of anyone who is hiring." Julio gave a grim chuckle. "Oh, there are folks hiring, but not for the greatest jobs. The tanner needs extra hands, the butcher needs an apprentice who can heft a side of meat, and the techno-wizards want someone to work the counter who won't blow a hand off moving things around." Dominic winced. "I trust that someone managed to get the unfortunate clerk to the healer?" Julio nodded. "Yeah, they tossed him in a cart and took him out to Larry's place. He'll be there a couple of days while he recovers." One of the newly arrived men smiled. "I will go talk to the techno-wizard. I worked at an artificer shop when I was in school, to pay tuition." "What did you study?" Julio asked, ready to make a note of someone who might be helpful in the future. "Classical literature. Or maybe not. He might make a good school teacher, though." The one who came with the lot from Grant Butte was frankly terrifying, and he pitted the kids who were in her classes. The father of the family group bowed slightly to the castellan. If you can point me toward the butcher, I have some experience in that field. My father was a huntsman, and while I didn't follow the family trade, I do at least know the basics of properly butchering an animal. One street past the inn on the right. He'll be happy to see you if you've got the skills. Now, I know that nobody wants jobs at the tannery. It smells awful, it's hot, and the pay isn't great. But it's work if anyone wants it. If not, there should be plenty of odd jobs for handymen around town. Talk to John, the carpenter. He's doing most of the renovation work on the old houses, and he knows the budget for hiring workers. Julio explained. Dominic considered their options for moving forward. Eventually, the city was going to need an industry. Something that people could do beyond serving as a marketplace for food exports, and an industry that would employ a large number of people. The obvious answer was something Magitech-related, as they had so many magically adept residents in town who would be looking for work for themselves and their children. For the moment, many of them were just getting by with what they could find, but the work for farm hands was primarily in the planting and harvest seasons. The tractors had taken a lot of the need for extra labor out, but there was still quite a bit available. He could try for something military as it would make a lot of money, but they were rather remote here, and that would make getting weapons to those who needed them difficult to do in a timely manner. So, they could focus on the transport aspect. Perhaps manufacturing roadwork machines? It shouldn't take too much to design one, and though it would take a trained operator, it would be incredibly valuable. With so many smaller roads to be upgraded, it would take years to get to them all. But that was still only a few years' worth of work before there would be enough of the machines to keep up with maintenance. Perhaps they should diversify? If they had a couple of factories in town, they would have a better chance of weathering downturns in demand. Perhaps one to make vehicles and one to make something else? It would have to be an unrelated field, but there was an ongoing demand for Magitech vehicles. The taste of the nobles was constantly changing, and when you introduced them to a new design, many would want it. Then, there was the discard factor. Old designs would be sold off to less wealthy nobles, and then eventually scrapped when they were run to the point they needed constant repairs. That kept the cycle of demand going strong, so it should be a solid base for the town. The question was whether they should risk going with a weapons factory, or if he should just focus on the things everyone needed. Making Magitech lamps might not sound glamorous, but the vast majority of the continent still didn't have them. If they started to mass-produce them, it would take a lifetime to make enough for them to spread to every common home, and by then, the first batch would need replacing. Another solid industry, as long as they had a skilled enough designer to keep up with the times. You look deep in thought, my lord. Sheriff Nate joked quietly. Just thinking of ways to get everyone back to work. But we need 3 things. Factories, workers who can mass-produce Magitech, and somewhere to train the workers. The sheriff chuckled. Well, I'm sure that we can find a few skilled teachers to run a class on basic Magitech engineering for factory workers. But what would you even want to make and sell? Lamps. The sheriff smiled. Magitech lights are the most underrated life-altering invention of our time. Seeing the lights on after dark at the farmhouses is a strange thing. We all know that they're not wealthy folk, but with the light, they don't have to stop at dark, and they can get started early, so they can be on the field at first light. Dominic nodded.
Exactly.
It extends the day. The tractors have lights for the same reason. But we might not need to just make lamps. If we can mass-produce Magitech stoves for cooking and heating, water pumps to give houses running water, and incinerating toilets, we can become the best source for all things lifestyle improvement. 2 lines of everything. Simple for the commoners, fancy for the nobles. And then we all get rich. Nate agreed. Chapter 275. Stable Income. With the new arrivals headed to town, Dominic returned to the manor to speak with the princess about his plans. She was likely going to have a better plan than the rough outline that he had come up with. She was much more details-oriented than he was, and he wanted to have something worked out before the next caravan got here, so that they could get word right to the top levels of the Merchants Guild. Getting teachers for a Magitech factory would be the hardest part. But the guild would also know what sold the fastest, what had the largest margin between materials and selling price, and other important details. Julio would know some of it as an accountant, but most of what he would know was the margins that the guild itself had on items that they bought and sold, not so much on items that didn't often get sold on the open market. Magitech most commonly sold directly from the creator to the noble who ordered it. Fortunately for Dominic, lights were simple if you didn't mind a bit of discoloration. The ones in the manor simply used a piece of quartz crystal set into the top of a Magitech orb sitting on a holder. The flow of mana lit up the crystal, and the glass of the lampshade diffused the light. Easy, but fragile. As expected, Alexis was in the library, which she used more like an office, as she preferred to be surrounded by books at all times instead of sitting in the actual office. She closed one book and prepared to change notebooks, moving on to a new topic. Perfect timing. Before you get started on the next thing, I have a proposal I want to run by you. Dominic began. Alexis nodded and gestured for him to sit across from her. All right, what is your brilliant idea of the day? Dominic smiled as he realized the book she had been about to open was the Duchy's financial report book. Work projects for the people. We're attracting magic users in droves, and we are likely to get more, so it occurred to me that we could use a Magitech factory owned directly by the Duchy. The simple things that every house should have, but that most can't currently afford. If we mass-produced Magitech lights, toilets, and pumps with water creation gems in them, we could bring the standard of not only the Duchy, but all of Signia ahead by decades. Now just cheap stuff. Good stuff for the nobles, upgrades that they would be proud to have. But also budget versions that any reasonably successful working family could afford if they wanted. Lamps change everyday life, especially for the ones who work the longest hours. But I'm also not a fan of the just dump it in the river solution to sewage that most cities have. So, I want incinerating toilets, and then we can let the plumbing dispose of shower and dishwater. Dominic explained. You know, most of the houses in town simply throw their dishwater into the garden. Alexis reminded him. Oh, good point. I wonder if there is an effective way to filter shower water? We could just let it fill barrels on the property, and then they can water gardens with it. Everyone has one for the rain gutters already. Dominic realized. That might be a bit expensive for the common person. How is the current plumbing system built? Alexis asked. Dominic shrugged. It runs from the house to the edge of the road, so when they shower, it just runs into the storm drains. I will have all the new streets built the same way, and the storm drains lead to the river. Alexis smiled. And that's why you don't want hundreds of more flush toilets? Because it all flows into the river, and your nose is sensitive. Plus, city water is disgusting enough without being downriver of that. Dominic agreed. That was hard to argue with. It was also a far superior solution to the other options that many cities still relied upon. All right. We already have an architect and his team on the way from the Merchants Guild, and they can do the design for the factory as well. Once you decide what they're making anyhow, you can enlist the techno-wizards if you want, and look through the village for others with some skill as artificers. But we might need to make a very specific request if we're going to start that sort of factory. Magitech items aren't something that just anyone can make from a blueprint. Alexis reminded him, right? Magic didn't work the same way for most people as it did for those with dragon blood. He had forgotten all about that for a moment, but it shouldn't be too hard to find workers with some skills in the area. After all, they had been basically run out of Dagos unless they fit the perfect image of what Dagos thought that a magic user should be. Plus, if they had skills, but didn't want to open a shop on their own, or didn't have the finances to try to compete with the shops that were already open, these would be incredibly high-paying jobs compared to nearly anything else that they could do. It might be factory work, but it was Magitech factory work, and that came with a level of respect. There wasn't much more that they could do today, and Julio was already off to make notes of what houses everyone had moved into and what skills they had. The man went well above and beyond his technical duties, a habit from his time with the Merchants Guild, where information was everything. That was a lesson that Dominic realized he should probably take to heart and get to know more of the people on a personal basis. But that could wait for a few days while he worked on his spell book and got some sketches done for the basic Magitech items that he wanted to become the core of their manufacturing facility. Chapter 276. Extra Workers. After 4 days of relative peace and hard work, The guard on duty reported a merchant guild caravan coming from the west. They were about to cross the bridge and head into the village with 6 trucks, so Dominic went out to meet them. With any luck, this should be the convoy with their architect. Dominic had dozens of pages of sketches ready for various products, and now he was ready to start with a true test of all his efforts, proving that they worked. But with the merchant caravan coming, it would have to wait. The caravan didn't turn into the village when they crossed the river. Instead, they turned to park in front of the ducal manor, confirming Dominic's suspicion that the architect and his team were on board. The convoy came to a stop just as Dominic stepped onto the porch. The Merchant Guild representative hopped down and walked over with a huge smile on his face, much more enthusiastic than delivering contracted workers would justify, no matter his cut of the commission. Duke Westover, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I have just what your duchy has been looking for, he declared. Oh, it sounds like you brought me something more than just an architect, Dominic replied. The merchant nodded happily. Indeed I did. The Merchants Guild bought out the Bethersia prisoner auction in Bridman. We have managed to get you almost an entire mage tower. Now, the authorities executed the sect leader and all the elders, but we managed to get most of the acolytes, and the price is very reasonable. Dominic narrowed his eyes in suspicion. There had to be a catch. Bethersia wasn't the biggest fan of sorcerers and demi-humans, but they didn't have a law against their presence. So, if they had purged an entire mage tower, there was likely an excellent reason for it, which meant that these were likely to be genuine criminals. Criminals that had such a reputation that the Merchants Guild had brought them with the caravan for nearly 4,000 kilometers. Nobody kept stock that long, and especially not an entire mage tower. Mages had genuine skills, they were welcome everywhere. Even if they had to be auctioned off one at a time and put under supervision, they should have all been sold long before they got anywhere near Stantia province. They had come across 2 countries after they left Bethersia, after all. All right, what are the details? I will buy up the contracts if they're not going to be a disruptive force. Dominic agreed. That made the merchant a bit nervous, and he immediately changed the topic. We can discuss that at the end of our delivery. I have brought your architect as well. He's got a 3-man team with him, and all are skilled in the construction arts. He waved the men forward, and the architect bowed to Dominic, while subtly speaking in the wavemate's hand language. Prince Dominic, welcome home. I look forward to working with you to rebuild the village. Dominic smiled. Welcome to Westover. We have grand plans for the village. Not just the burnt houses, but also for apartment blocks and factories. I intend to make an entire Magitech factory in town to serve as our primary export. The architect nodded happily. And which family might own the factory? I will make plans to arrange it in the off hours of rebuilding the village. Mine. The factory will be owned by the duchy directly, and I am hoping that we can find a few suitable Magitech engineers to train the workers. I wish to export Magitech household goods. Lights, restroom facilities, showers, and such. Not just for noble houses, but in bulk without ornamentation for common homes. Dominic explained. The architect and the merchant shared an excited smile. So, you wish to bring back the glory days of a fully magical society, but with Magitech? We will fully support that mission. The merchant agreed. Villagers and farmers were beginning to make their way toward the caravan, and the merchant turned his attention their way. You have more food again? Didn't anybody tell Westover that there is a famine going on? So much cropland was destroyed, and the rest of the eastern continent is in a drought. Signia is mostly breaking even, but many regions are starting to ration. But even Mitfield is running short on food in the cities. He explained. Dominic shrugged. We've got good fields and witches. We haven't even had to turn on the irrigation yet, which is probably a good thing, because most of it is broken. We should move the mages before the farmers get here. There are things you should know. The merchant gestured. Obviously. You moved them across 2 entire countries without selling them. Dominic replied. Don't you think that I would have gotten rid of them if I could? You'll understand when you are around them for a few minutes. The mages came out of the caravan in an unhurried line, looking around in awe at their surroundings and chatting excitedly. Wilkes nudged Carl's shoulder. Why is there a whole group of Puritans here? He whispered. Their tower was expelled from Bethersia, so we're gaining some mages. At least, most likely. It's not finalized yet, Dominic replied. The royal guard frowned. Those weren't just mages. They were Vestal virgins of the Purity sect mage clans. They were cursed to cause immense pain to anyone who touched them with ill intent or lewd intentions. Their clan wasn't local to Signia, but every royal guard knew who they were. The most insufferable humans on the face of the planet. At least from a guardsman's point of view. And you want to take them in to form a new mage tower here? Wilkes confirmed. Most definitely. They make excellent advisors because they know you can't slap them for speaking their mind without hurting yourself. Dominic joked. One of the mages, a young acolyte boy who might not yet be in his teens, giggled as he heard Dominic's comment. Julio ushered the mages into the house, where Dominic could hear them politely greeting the staff and Beth fussing about how skinny they all were. They might get along just fine. Chapter 277. Purity Sect Mages. The architectural team sighed as they saw the mages go inside. You're going to have trouble with those ones, my lord. They absolutely refuse to break a contract and insist it's beneath their dignity to do anything less than speak the whole truth, even when they're being absolute jerks about it. The architect insisted. Wilkes nodded in agreement, and Dominic shrugged. Well, we can have you build them a nice tower on the edge of town where they won't bother anyone. But what contract could they have that would be an issue for me? Are they currently working for someone else? He asked. The merchant laughed grimly.
No.
Their criminal slave contract. They were sentenced to a life of servitude and sold. But the contract requires that in order to be transferred, the owner must take a fair price for them. It's a normal thing for prisoner contracts, but what is fair is usually up to interpretation. The thing is, they refuse to accept negotiations, and every time I've tried to kick them out for a handful of coppers, the magic of the contract stops me from leaving town. The merchant looked over his shoulder to where the closest of farmers were already approaching with carts. Your people are far too proactive. They didn't even check if I had space before bringing over trade goods.
He joked.
Dominic shrugged. There is always space by the time a convoy gets this far. The process hasn't failed them yet. Besides, their pantries are full, and we're running out of canning jars. Unless you brought a bunch, that is. Not worried that I will try to lowball them because they have excess? Dominic smirked and pointed to the large half-ogre woman who was coming from one of the farms closest to the manor. If you try to scam her, she's likely to take you over her knee, and I'm not sure that you can stop her. The merchant gave the woman an appraising smile. Now that's a whole lot of woman. Reminds me a bit of my own mother, that one. Except for the face. I will let you get to business, and you can check in with me when you are ready to leave, so I can give you your commission payment. Dominic explained, then turned to lead the architect into the house. The mages were all sitting in a group on the floor facing Alexis, who had turned one of the padded recliners to face them. Beth had brought food for them all, sandwiches and soup, but they had chosen not to eat at the table. It took Dominic a moment, then he realized the issue. They refused to go against the rules. Any rules. So, as they were currently condemned prisoners, they were refusing to eat at a noble's table. Dominic could understand why everyone got frustrated trying to deal with them. But once they were in a tower with even basic directions, they should be a valued asset to the duchy. Julio handed the architect and his people the prepared work contracts, as well as the stack of potential city designs that they had come up with. The actual building designs would be up to them, but some of the original plans were there for reference. This shouldn't be an issue. We're all familiar with the traditional styles and construction methods. The wages and terms are what we were expecting. The only thing we will ask is leeway to alter the layout as needed to keep city design functional and safe for residents. The architect requested. Alexis nodded. That shouldn't be an issue. If there are safety concerns, you can address them before the buildings even go up. As long as they have the basic amenities that we requested, you're free to do your job as you see fit. Now, I have one more suggestion, though it's not part of the contract. Perhaps you would like to stay in the manor for the first few days and begin the reconstruction with your own homes? We are beginning to run short of homes in town, and I suspect that you would not care for a hunter's lodge or a farmhouse. Dominic offered. The men smiled and bowed politely. Then we will prevail upon your grace's generous offer. Indeed, we are not well suited to life on a farm. We did come with a full set of household goods, though. The architect gestured to the ring on his finger, and Dominic nodded. That makes things much easier. The surviving homes mostly had the basics, so we will save them for the refugees. The locals have also salvaged as much as possible from the burned homes, but the vast majority of goods did not survive the fires. They would have to make new ones at some point, but obtaining pots, dishes, and bedding was much easier than creating the house to put them in. Then Dominic turned to the mages. So, I am told that you are requiring a fair payment for the transfer of your contracts. That likely wasn't easy to get at any of the other locations. Not many will pay good money for criminals that they can't discipline or abuse, even if you are skilled mages. Well, I assume that you're skilled mages and not just a bunch of fresh acolytes who don't know one end of a rune string from another. One of the older boys laughed, and a teen girl shushed him. Duke Dominic, I don't know if you are aware, but the magic imbued in our oaths requires us to uphold all contracts we have made. We agreed to this contract in exchange for escaping execution. It requires fair payment to transfer ownership, so we cannot allow it to transfer without payment. She explained. Dominic nodded. What did the Merchants Guild pay for you? 5 silver coins each. The standard rate for fresh convicts. Then I will give him 7.5 silver coins for each of you, a 50% profit on his investment. Dominic offered. The mages all looked confused for a moment, and Dominic realized that they had been calculating in a very different way, likely based on the lifetime earnings potential of a mage. But when Dominic framed it this way, it would definitely seem unfair for him to make thousands of times his investment just to transport them for a while, especially when they had helped with all the domestic duties during the trip and protected the caravan with their magic. Chapter 278, Magical Duties. What do you propose that you'll do with us if you purchase us? One of the boys asked. The princess is looking for a few more trustworthy veiled maids, and if you hold true to your clan's oath, then the ladies of the Purity sect should be good for that. The others, I intend to move into a tower in town to work off their sentence. Infrastructure, street cleaning, defensive magic, magitech factory work. All are options suitable to the employment of criminals, and you will be suitably housed and fed for the remainder of your lives. If you want to take in new members, that is fine too. These fine gentlemen will ensure that the tower is large enough for them. The mages simply stared at Dominic for a moment. There was something wrong with his logic, but they couldn't quite place it. While it was true that they were serving a life sentence, it sounded a lot like he intended to be their employer, not their jailer. Did the Duke misunderstand the irrevocable nature of the magical contract they had signed when they were sentenced? But they had underestimated the utter shamelessness of Dominic's plan. He needed magical workers, and these literally could not leave once he purchased their contracts. A loyal base of skilled mages, all of whom were young, and sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor? Wasn't that decades of guaranteed skilled workers? Even diverting a few to the Princess Veiled Guard wouldn't harm his efforts to develop the duchy into a cutting-edge magitech factory city.
Well, town.
It would be some time before they could claim to be anything so grand as a city. After a moment, the mages bowed. We will agree to your fair purchase terms, Your Grace. Please assign us tasks. Alexis smiled as she looked at the group. This will work out perfectly. I will take all 5 of the girls as trainee veiled maids, and they can bolster the domestic staff. Ladies, please follow my assistant to change into your new uniforms. Gentlemen, the first task that we have for you is to assist the architects in preparing an area for housing expansion. After everyone's belongings are unloaded, that is, you will have the honor of helping build your own new home. She wholeheartedly approved of Dominic's choice to take the mages into the house instead of looking for locals. Every noble lady worried about the staff trying to gain favors by sneaking into the Lord's bed when she was away. But these ones were literally incapable of such things. Not that she doubted Dominic's loyalty. Plus, he was pathologically incapable of keeping a secret, and if one of the staff actually offered, he would never be able to hide it from her. Dominic tossed Julio a pouch full of coins to pay the merchant for the mages and the finding fee for the architects, then let them go about their day. The men had a lot of work ahead of them, planning the exact locations, staking out house and street plans for the expansion, and deciding what they would do for a mage tower. It should be obvious to them that Dominic intended to find more mages for the tower, so they would make it with plenty of extra space. Having all those extra mages would make life much easier for the architects, and Dominic finally had hoped that they could keep up with the influx of refugees. Even a half-dozen apartment blocks built over commercial buildings would go a long way to housing workers, and they shouldn't have to wait long for the factory to be built. It might actually take longer to get the raw materials that they needed for production than to get the factory built. If you will excuse us, my lord, we will go scout the locations right away. We need to unpack our belongings as well. The architect suggested. Take your time, get unpacked, shower, eat. The land will still be there. Dominic agreed. The male mages followed him out just as the girls of the Purity sect came back out in their new uniforms, simple black dresses with long sleeves and veils covering their lower face. It wasn't difficult to tell them from the sisters, as the mages were all still children. But at least now they looked like proper veiled maids. The sisters led them through the house, pointing out all the various rooms and the chores that went with them. Keeping so many maids in the house seemed a bit excessive, but Dominic could hear the cook welcoming them and the maids explaining that they had a spare room set up with bunks so the mages could continue to share a room. At the rate that they were going, Dominic was going to have to put an expansion on the manor as well, just to hold all the extra staff. There was an unused barracks building in the area, but that had been vacant long before the invasion and probably wasn't suitable for occupants. He could have them upgrade that later so they would have somewhere for a standing military force to stay once they had a full-time town guard. They could work on that once the militia was trained. Now that they had experts in place, he could relax a little and let them work on the hard parts while he approved development plans. His spell book was coming along very well, and soon he would be able to create pistols with proper tool steel quality directly from the clay to steel spell. Once he was at that standard, Dominic knew that life would get much easier. Many Magitech items could be created using spells at that level with much simpler tools and materials. It would save him both time and money, and that meant that he could put more effort into developing new products. He had sketches for the simplest of Magitech hanging lamps, and those could be their first product for the factory. But first, he would have to ask the mages if they knew the spell to create simple gems. It was possible, he knew. He just didn't have the spell knowledge. Chapter 279. Free Supplier. Dominic waved one of the new mages over, and she politely knelt at his feet, the way that royal maids would when being reprimanded. You're not in trouble. I have a question. Do you know the magic to create quartz crystals for light and water creation Magitech artifacts? Dominic clarified. She looked vaguely confused, but nodded. Yes, my lord. Those are basic spells for any acolyte of the Purity Tower. That is wonderful news. We will be building a factory to make Magitech household goods, and those gems will be critical to our production. Do any of the boys have training in Magitech engineering? The girl shook her head. No, my lord. The Purity Tower is a purely magical academy. Or it was. That reminds me, what was it that got the entire tower purged?
He asked.
The girls looked at each other uneasily, unwilling to answer, but bound by their sect's rules and the prisoner contract not to lie. The sect leader backed the second prince of Bethersia in the succession battle. The second prince lost and was executed for treason, and his entire faction was purged, including our tower, naturally. We were given a life sentence for providing magical weapons to the rebel forces. The girl explained. Alexis sighed. I should have known that it would be something like that. Dominic attracts rebel mages like a magnet. The mage bowed her head. We were acolytes at the tower, hardly involved at all, other than making spell gems and crystals for the seniors. That is why we were granted leniency instead of execution. That explained why they were all so young. Everyone old enough to have joined the battle was killed, either in action or in court. Well, that's not a great reputation to have, but I trust that you and your companions will be loyal and on their best behavior now that you're here and in service to the 9th Princess of Signia. I will check in on the boys later to ensure that they're not thinking of anything improper. Dominic replied. The mages giggled at his phrasing, and Dominic shrugged. There is a lot of trouble that young boys can get into without any inappropriate contact. Alexis turned her attention back to the mages. You say that you were providing magical weapons to the rebels. But you said that you are not skilled in magitech. The mage kneeling beside Dominic nodded politely. Indeed. But the Purity sect is a versatile and traditional mage sect. We are quite skilled at imbuing items with combat magic, even though all our spell gems were confiscated when we were arrested. However, we can only act in self-defense. That means you can create new spell gems for the spells you know, does it not? Alexis asked. Naturally. Alexis smirked at Dominic. Then I believe we will have additional tasks for you, beyond the domestic duties and training as veiled maids. Our town guard will need to be properly equipped, and I am eager to find out what the acolytes of the Purity sect have retained. The girls were clearly skeptical of her intentions, but they were surprisingly fast to accept Alexis' proposition. Of course, Your Highness. Whether it is defending your person or helping your people defend themselves, now that our life debt has been transferred to you, we live to serve. The mage girl replied quickly. Then, she did a double take as Dominic patted her head and motioned for her to rise. That was unexpected. If he had any sort of bad intentions, it should have shocked him to the point his arm went numb, at the very least. But nothing had happened to him. Did that mean he didn't view them as females? Or perhaps he viewed them as still being children, and it was an indulgent pat, like a parent would give? He was rather young looking for that, though Dragonkin aged slowly. The entire concept of a head pat was confusing to them, as they had been pledged to the Purity sect at a young age, and there was no physical contact at all between members, unless necessary to complete a task. The truth was that Dominic had gotten used to Cutter silently following him around as he toured the territory, and he had briefly forgotten that it was not the aging hunting dog at his side. Her hair was the same sandy brown color as the dog's fur. Dominic rose to his feet and motioned toward the door. I will go see what is holding up the others. If they have brought a large number of tools, I will see that someone helps them get unloaded. Outside the manor, the young mages were indeed helping the architectural team unload tools into a storage shed. They had brought not just the drafting and design tools that Dominic had expected, they had also brought construction and surveying tools. The farmers had nearly finished their sales, and the last few were haggling with the merchant over the space that was being vacated by the tools the architect and his team had brought. The merchant was politely refusing, as he had no guarantee that he could sell more than he would be picking up at the next stop. But Dominic could see that he was being worn down. The next stop on his route was Limpsbury, and the city was in rough shape since the war. They hadn't taken heavy casualties, but they had lost most of the city's wealth when the Dago's nobles and businessmen had fled during the early days of the occupation. So, while the city wasn't overrun with homeless refugees like Castle City and some others were, there were still plenty of impoverished residents, and even more coming from areas that simply couldn't sustain residents anymore. With the change in leadership, the people of Stantia province were hoping that good things might start to happen to them for the first time in a decade. They needed a lot, but they also needed money. Many apprentices should have taken over the shops by now, and even if the quality wasn't as good as before, it should still be worth buying for the Merchants Guild. Every little bit counted, and loading up with too much perishable food wasn't the most profitable load at the best of times. And especially not when you were hundreds of kilometers from the next city. Chapter 280, Message from Mitfield. Dominic walked over to say goodbye to the merchant, and quietly pocketed the scroll that one of the assistants handed him. Safe travels, and I do hope to see you again soon. By then, we might even have more to offer than just groceries. Dominic joked. The merchant shook his hand with a smile. I believe that you will. With so many qualified people here, I look forward to the day when the guild can negotiate a longer-term supply deal with your factories. With their business finished, the merchant caravan packed up and began making their way out of town toward the baronies. They probably wouldn't have anything to trade just yet, but the caravan did have things to sell if they needed them. And this was the last inhabited region they would see for at least a day. Once everything was calm, Dominic went to the office and sat down to read the rolled scroll that the assistant had handed to him. Then he paused when he saw the Mitfield royal seal on the wax. This wasn't just any letter, it was their first official royal communication. But it came from a foreign royal family member, not a local. Stantia province did border the kingdom, so it wasn't as if they were strangers. But to get a message from their royal family with the first caravan that came from that direction was more than a little shocking. If they had followed the main roads for most of the trip, the caravan would have been on the other side of the country from the capital. Carefully, Dominic cracked the wax seal and opened the single-page letter. Prince Dominic Wavemates. It is a distinct pleasure to hear that your lineage has been recognized by our royal cousin Insignia. Please accept my congratulations on being awarded Westover, and know that I do look forward to seeing what you can do with it. I trust that our wedding gift found its way into your possession, but if not, please accept my apology for the untimely delay. There have been some transport issues in recent times. Prince George Mitfield, Duke of Dunstow, 5th Prince of Mitfield, Lord Commander of the Armies. Now it made a bit more sense. Dunstow was one of the cities that the caravan would have passed through, and it was close enough to the border that Mitfield would have staged large military forces there, in case the war breached the borders. But that was not the important part of the innocuous-looking letter. When he had gotten married, he had been given the title of Duke of Westover, but he had not been made a prince consort of Signia. That distinction would be lost on many, but on another prince? Definitely not. So, what Prince George was saying was that in some subtle way, Mitfield still recognized the royalty of the Wavemates lineage. Enough that they would address him as such in a letter. His actual qualifications as a prince were questionable, though royal law said that when a lineage was lost, the next closest branch would be elevated. So, under the laws of succession, he was quite likely the highest-ranking prince of the Wavemates family by default. Dominic briefly recalled that more than one person had questioned whether he was actually the princess consort's child, given to a family member to raise. However, without proof to the contrary, he was happy to think of his family as he remembered it. Alexis came in while he was staring at the letter, and Dominic simply turned it over to her, so she could form opinions for herself. So, Mitfield thinks you might be the next Dragon King, do they? But that note about transport delays. There were no battles along the route from their capital to ours, other than the battle at Burton, which was over well before they would have been sending wedding gifts. So, something else is happening that is still delaying shipments and messages between Mitfield and either Stantia province or all of Signia. Alexis noted. That had escaped Dominic in his first reading. Do you think that there might be Dago's forces hiding in the less inhabited regions near the joint border of Signia, Mitfield, and Stantia province? Dominic asked. Alexis nodded. I think that is precisely what he means. There was no need to point out that he was Lord Commander if the letter didn't refer to his military duties. Also, he addressed it directly to you, not to me. I've known Prince George since I was little. He used to be the diplomatic envoy to Signia and lived in the palace. While it's difficult to call anyone with power a true friend, Prince George is like an uncle to me. Yet, he wrote his first letter to you instead, and didn't name me personally. Then she lit a candle and moved the letter over it, revealing a single line of hidden text. Congratulations, Princess. Mr. Bear still sits on the south shelf. Dominic read the line, then waited for Alexis to explain as she was lost in nostalgia. The south shelf is what Mitfield calls the Coster Plateau along the Wavemates side of the border. Mr. Bear is a stuffed toy that I gave to his youngest daughter for her 3rd birthday 2 years ago. It's over a meter tall, and she absolutely refused to release it for an entire week. She even brought it to dinner in the palace. That's the last time we spoke in person, as he returned to Mitfield after that visit. So, there is a military issue on the border but within Stantia province. One that he can't openly report or send the Mitfield army after. They might be staging to use the Maltenden River to get into Signia. Or, it might be leftovers from the monster invasion and the mages who are behind them.
Dominic theorized.
Alexis nodded. Or, it might just be whoever is behind Prince Kaizan and his insane antics. We've already seen one attack, and it's no secret where we live. They may be preparing for vengeance against the most remote Signia princess. If that was the case, they were in for a world of hurt. Now that Westover had a proper group of mages, all of whom had been trained in combat magic, so they could make magical weapons, it would be extremely difficult to invade the duchy. You should make new artillery for the defenders. I will announce the change of plans from a militia force to a full-time town guard force. We've already got all the men we need. Alexis decided. I will go talk to the tailors. Dominic agreed. A proper town guard needed a bit more ornamentation than the militia did. At the very least, an emblem of service, so everyone would know who they were. If you were going to rain artillery on your enemies, you needed to do it in style.